5, 4. Order. Welcome to today's session of the Select Committee on Business and Trade. Today we're looking at labour rights. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, Mr. Hebblethwaite. Perhaps I could just kick off by asking, are you basically a modern-day pirate?
We recognise that we made a very difficult decision 2 years ago, one that was legal, but we also have to acknowledge, and one that I wish we had never, ever had to make in the first place. But we also have to acknowledge that without that difficult decision, P&O would not be here today, and we would not have been able to preserve the 2,000 jobs that we have been able to preserve, take the 135,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions that we have taken out of our carbon footprint, open up new routes, but continue to serve the most important trade route between the UK and the continent.
The French Maritime Minister, though, as you know, Hervé Breville, has described the company's behaviour as dangerous and immoral. Are you dangerous and immoral, or both?
So, I'm very pleased to be able to inform the committee that in point of fact our safety record has improved by 66%. We continue to operate an increasingly safe fleet of ships.
Well, you seem to be robbing your staff blind, however. And so I'd like to get into some of the details about the pay, if you don't mind. In March 2022, you told Parliament that you would pay staff £5.15 going forward. But I've seen data, and the committee has seen data, that suggests that you're now paying for the first 8 hours a basic rate of just £2.86. That's a quarter of the national minimum wage. Is that figure right?
I think it's important that we compare apples with apples. So exchange rates move about, but if I can take a moment to explain how international minimum wages are set and demonstrate that we pay in excess of those standards where we are governed by international law. So the International Labour Organization has an agreement with the International Transport Workers Federation that there is a minimum basic wage of, depending on exchange rate, about £2.18. We then pay nearly double that, and in addition to that, the Marine Labour Convention, the MLC, requires us to pay, in addition to that basic wage, a guaranteed overtime, a guaranteed bonus, and holiday, and that takes payment per hour to something like £5 an hour.
I'm just looking at a spreadsheet in front of me, though, which, say, for example, for a cook for the first 8 hours, $800, so that's over 30 days, that's $28 a day, that's $3.58 per hour, that's £2.90, roughly speaking, an hour. I mean, how can you possibly justify paying so little per hour? And how can you reconcile it with the promise that you made to Parliament in March 2022 when you said that you'd be paying £5.15?
So we are
low enough.
We are paying considerably ahead of the international minimum standard. We believe that it is right that as an international business operating in international waters, we should be governed by international law.
But you'd accept that the rates I've just quoted for the first 8 hours for a cook is lower than the rate that you promised you'd be paying to Parliament in 2022?
When I spoke to Parliament in 2022, I was talking about consolidated rates of pay that include all of the guaranteed bonus, all of the guaranteed overtime, and the holiday pay, and that takes that total payment to around £5, and at the rate of exchange that we were talking about 2 years ago on Dover-Calais, that was about £5.15.
But you can understand how in March 2022 Parliament would have come away from the hearing thinking that you were going to be paying £5.15, and now we're learning for the first 8 hours that a cook is being paid about £2.90 an hour.
We're not comparing apples with apples. It's important that we do compare apples with apples. The £5.15 that I quoted in 2022 was the full consolidated rate of pay that included the guaranteed bonus, the guaranteed overtime, and the holiday pay.
So what is the average hourly rate of your agency crew now?
Full consolidated pay is approximately £5.20 an hour.
What's the lowest hourly rate of your agency crew?
I think the lowest fully consolidated hourly pay is about £4.87.
Extraordinary. Now, thanks to the agreement that the French are bringing in, pay rates do now, I understand, have to rise to £9.95 an hour, which is the French minimum wage, and that limits the number of consecutive days that seafarers can work to 14, followed by the equivalent time ashore. Is P&O going to comply in full with this law when the grace period ends?
Yes. We have always complied with the international and national laws that we are governed by. So, of course, we will, yes.
And will you begin moving to paying the UK national minimum wage where you can?
So we already, where we are governed by national minimum wage in this country, we already pay national minimum wage as a minimum. And the moment that that changes with the new legislation that's coming in, we will absolutely comply with that, yes.
But you must realise that for many people watching this session, learning that staff are paid as low as £4.87 will be something of a shock.
What I must emphasise in the strongest terms, please, is that these are international seafarers in an international business in international water, that we pay considerably ahead of the international minimum standard, that we believe that that's right, but not just me, I would emphasise that our crewing agent, who are responsible for our crews and employ our crews, have no problem with recruitment, no problem with retention. In addition to that, we, I think, offer seafarer welfare on board that is second to none. Every seafarer has their own cabin, they have their own restaurants, they have their own recreation space, they have their own gyms. But please don't take my word for it. I would love for you to come on board and talk to the seafarers yourself.
Well, we will certainly check some of the evidence that we've received, but I mean, do you think you could live on £4.87 an hour?
No, I couldn't.
But why do you think that your staff should have to live on that?
As I say, apologies for repeating myself, but these are international seafarers that we are, or our recruitment, or our crewing agent is recruiting from an international field, and we pay substantially ahead of the international seafaring minimum wage.
So you've said that pay will go up because of the French agreement.
It will.
But you also told the committee in March 2022 that P&O Ferries would basically go bust unless you sacked 786 workers and replaced them with agency staff earning well below the UK minimum wage. So now that the French have made this business model illegal, you do seem to be able to afford these wages. So what has changed?
It's important, if I may, just for one small correction, that we didn't sack anybody. We did initiate a redundancy programme where we paid substantially above the statutory requirements. But it is true that we did change the crewing model. And all we have ever asked for as part of this is a level playing field, that we are able to operate to the same standard as our competitors in an international business. The changes to both the UK and the French law maintain a level playing field, and therefore we are operating within the same bounds as our competitors. And that is all we've ever asked for, a level playing field, so that we can build a competitive business, we can keep P&O going, and we can preserve the 2,000 jobs that we have been able to preserve as a result of the beginning of the transformation programme that we started 2 years ago, that is ongoing.
Your argument is that the business model is now affordable because some kind of safety net has been put underneath the whole industry.
My argument is that we are now able to operate on a level playing field, and all we've ever wanted to do is to be able to turn P&O into a competitive and dynamic business, which we have been able to do with the crewing change that we made, and that the French and the UK legislation doesn't change.
So when the staff were, I think, made redundant, basically, 2 years ago, since then you've been flying crew in from countries like India and Malaysia and the Philippines to work for up to 17 hours a week on the ships. What will happen to those staff now that you're going to implement the new French laws?
So it's important that these are not our employees. They are the employees of the crewing agent. So we employ a third party to crew our ships. We are working, and the crewing agent, we are working with the crewing agent, and the crewing agent is working with their crew to make sure that we can continue to recruit from an international field.
Those staff who are currently working on your ships, what will happen to them? Will they stay or will they be let go?
The crewing agent are working with them to see how we can make it possible for as many of them to stay as possible.
There's no guarantees at this stage that they will be allowed to continue?
Or that they will not be.
Okay. Now, that may entail you replacing a lot of crew in quite short order. Do you expect that your ships will be detained by safety regulators to ensure that all the adequate training is in place, given the very rapid change which may be about to unfold?
So I expect our crewing agent to have no problem recruiting the highest standard seafarers, as they have been able to do since we started this change, and I have no expectation of that changing going forward.
Okay. Mr. Lavery.
Mr. Hebblethwaite, you don't mind willful exploitation of the workforce, do you? I think. Do you enjoy it? Is it something that gives you great pleasure?
I categorically have to say that I don't think that is at all the characterisation of what we are doing. We employ an international crew above and beyond international standards, and I think our seafarer welfare is second to none.
The £4.87 an hour, 17 weeks at a time, without any holidays, any breaks. It's fine, because it's within international law.
That's not true. Can I correct you, please? The Maritime Labour Convention requires seafarers to have a minimum of 2.5 days off every month. On Dover Calais, we contract for 7 days off every month, and on the North Sea, 9 days off every month. So your characterisation of the agency's crew model is not quite right.
Well, that's the information that we've got, that you've got people working for 17 weeks at a time on the ships, 12-hour shifts. And the question obviously would be, what sort of condition, health-wise, are these individuals actually in? Are they fatigued? Are they burnt out? Is there illness? Because that's like, as described by somebody in the ITV documentary, a number of workers said it was like being in prison. Yet what you've said yourself already this morning, the first 10 minutes of this inquiry, is that you look at them so well. They've got their own rooms, they've got cinemas, they've got gyms. It seems like a cruise ship, a pleasure ship. It's not what the workers are saying.
So,
plus for £4.87 an hour. So, not right here?
So, our seafarer welfare is second to none. We pay well ahead of the standards by which we are governed by. We provide hours of work that are substantially better than the hours that are identified in international law, that this government and all of its predecessors and 96% of all seafaring nations have signed up to. But let me try and answer it in a different way. Our seafarers, the seafarers of our crewing agent, to be more accurate, choose to come to work for us. They have no problem recruiting, and they have very, very high levels of retention. And therefore, I would extend the same invitation to you that I did the chair. Don't take my word for it. Please, come on board. Talk to our seafarers. Talk to our agents, seafarers. See the conditions we offer them. See the gym that we offer them. See the restaurants we offer them. See the cabins that we give them and the recreational space. And talk to our seafarers. And I am absolutely certain that you will be encouraged by their positive response. Our retention rates, or the retention rates of our crewing agent, are exceptionally high, and I think that is evidence in itself. But don't take my word for it. Come on board, have a look, please. I would love to host that.
Well, Mr. Hebblethwaite, believe me, I haven't took your word for it, and I'll not. I've spoken to people who work on the ferries. I've spoken to people who represent people who work on the ferries, and they've got an absolutely different view to yourself. Individuals are saying that apart from the wages being as deplorable, that they cannot even leave the ship within a 17-week period. Is that right?
I don't recognise that characterisation. I also have been on board our ships. I'm guessing I've spoken to a great number of seafarers. In fact, we were on board only last week talking to the seafarers who were explaining how keen they are to continue working for P&O, because they believe that they are well paid and that the conditions on board are second to none. And therefore I reiterate my invitation. Please come with me and come and talk to the seafarers that I talk to.
Are you seriously telling this? Are you seriously telling this? Sorry if my voice is too low. Are you seriously saying to this committee that you've got people working on these ferries saying that they think the wages are fair and they're very well paid? You've just said that. You didn't say very well paid. You said well paid.
I said that they seafarers that are employed through our agents believe they are appropriately paid, and they could choose to work anywhere, but they choose to come and work for us.
Mr. Hebblethwaite, you actually said that people working for you thought they were well paid and well looked after. That's what you said. Not appropriately, you said well.
Yeah.
And you know, can I just roll back just ever so slightly to what you said before, and you attempted to correct the chair of the committee when you said these individuals in 2022 weren't sacked. Now, these people who worked for your company, you're the chief executive, weren't made aware of the fact that they were losing their employment until masked security, trained security guards went onto a ferry. Masks, balaclavas, handcuffs, and marched people, workers, your workers, they marched them off the ferry. And then there was the uproar, which meant basically that's one of the reasons why, as the chief executive, you're sitting here today. They're not sacking people. Are you proud of that? Were you proud of what you saw, what millions of people internationally saw on the television from companies such as P&O?
Let's be 100% clear about that. What was reported was not true. The description that you have just given was not true. It is true that everybody who was at work that day was informed in person, face to face. But the rest of that description is simply not true.
Is that it? It's just not true. Is that what you're saying?
I'm
so
saying
what the
description,
new Sorry, go on.
I do apologise. You go.
So we certainly are witnessed on the television, and I've spoken to people, and I've spoken to representatives of people and individuals who later took cases up against P&O, and individuals who actually agreed the terms of settlement with P&O, and that's exactly the way that it happened. We saw individuals being frog-marched off in handcuffs from that place of employment, where many of them had been, obviously been on the ferry for quite some time. It was a second home, as we all agree on. And you're saying that didn't happen?
I'm absolutely saying that didn't happen, and if you can provide me with evidence, of course I will review that. But I was there, and I know that did not happen.
That didn't happen. Right now.
What you have described did not happen. What I can assure you is that this was an incredibly difficult decision that we made as a decision of absolute last resort, and that half of the crew were at work that day, and we spoke to them all face to face.
You knew that it wasn't in line with national legislation, the way that their men were dismissed, that them staff. And I think you've said, I think in evidence to the business committee, was that you knew that was the case. The trade unions would never agree with, so you would never speak to them about it anyway. And the fact that you needed to do it in the best interests of P&O, that's the practice you decided to carry out on that day.
So there has been some, in my opinion, not quite fully accurate reporting of this. And let me take the opportunity, thank you for giving me the opportunity to clear up something that I don't think has been completely clear. After COVID, this business needed to modernise, needed to employ on the basis of a competitive and dynamic crew model. We were unable to successfully negotiate that, and therefore we're left with the very, very difficult decision, one that I regret we had to make at all, and one that I am deeply sorry to those 786 seafarers and their family. But we were left with the only remaining decision to change the crewing model. We sought extensive advice from leading law firms and multiple then QCs, now KCs. The advice came back to us that our decision was legal, and therefore with great regret we implemented the change in crewing model the way we did. It is right that I was asked to come before a version of this committee to answer questions about that. It is also right that the government should check the legal position. The government has initiated 2 investigations, the first of which has finished and has concluded with no further action. The second of which I can't really comment on, other than to say that I remain, and we remain, as confident of the second outcome as we were the first. We, throughout this, sought extensive legal advice that confirmed that this decision was legal. That is not to say I don't regret it. I regret it, and I am deeply sorry for the impact it had on 786 seafarers and their families. I wish we had never had to make that decision.
Did you say you'd do it again?
Again, I think that is out of context, so I do want to be clear. We will never make that decision again.
But did you actually say after the event you regretted the decision you've had, what you had to do, but you would do it again? Did you actually say that? Because that's what was widely reported.
That does not take the full context of what I said, and therefore does not represent what I said. But I am pleased to have the opportunity to clear that up, and let me be absolutely clear that we would not make that decision again.
Now, the workers who works up to 17 weeks at a time on the ferries, are they allowed to leave the ship at any time?
I believe they are, but I believe there are some technicalities. So if you don't mind, can I get back to you with the exact response on that? Because I think there are certain conditions under which they are, because as international seafarers, there will be border restrictions. And rather than guess at an answer, I'd rather write back to the committee with a full answer, if I may.
You think they should be able to leave the ship within 17-week periods, just over 4 months?
So, as I say, I may come back to you on the exact conditions under which the seafarers can leave the ship, but it is important to revisit this point about we contract the third party, crewing agent, contracts the seafarers on terms that are better than the international standard, and they have the international standard is 2.5 days off per month, and on the Channel the seafarers are contracted with 7 days off per month, and on the North Sea 9 days off per month, and therefore the seafarers employed on our ships by the third party crewing agent are subject to terms that are significantly better, both financial and working conditions, than the minimum international standard, and I think that's important.
Any crew members working more than 17 weeks at a time?
It is possible that there are some crew on the North Sea that do work slightly longer. I think that you are referring to the Dover-Calais route.
They're all.
I will confirm that for you.
Okay.
But anybody employed on our ships is employed in line with and better than the laws that we are governed by.
I'm not sure if that's like the best argument that you've got. If you're exploiting workers just because it's better than other exploited workers, doesn't mean to say that you're like, you know, that the model that people should be looking at, because, you know, as has already been said by a number of members of the committee, you know, you're paying people what, £4.87 to work in 70 weeks at a time. I surmise that they'll not be able to get off the ship. They're described as being in a prison. You continually have said this morning that it's the third party that employs the workers. Surely you've got some influence on this third party, the agency who employs your workers. If you're going to employ somebody via an agency, surely you instruct the agency on what you expect to be in their contract, or do you not have much contact with them?
So there's a few comments in there, if I may. The first is that it is important to remember that we work in a shipping industry. That industry is an international industry. It recruits from an international field, and it operates in international waters, and therefore it is appropriate that it's governed by international law that this government and its predecessors have signed up to, and 96% of all shipping nations sign up to. We operate significantly ahead of those standards, and that is important to us as well. One of the reasons as well is that it is important that we operate on a level playing field to the same standard as our competitors.
It's not the same standard though, is it? Because you're not paying the same as your competitors, you're paying less, and I think that the working standards are actually lower.
I think our working standards are second to none. Please come on board. Please come and see for yourself. Come and talk to the seafarers yourself. This is the standard crewing model across this international industry. We previously had a model that left us as an uncompetitive outlier. All we've wanted to do is operate to the same standards as our competitors, and this is the standard crewing model across the industry.
Mr. Laver, I interrupted you.
Oh, that's fine. The Voluntary Seafarers Charter, there's other ferry companies, DFDS Ferries, Condor Ferries, Brittany Ferries, Stena, have all signed up that you haven't signed the Seafarers Charter. Is there any danger that you might?
So the UK Seafarers Charter, I don't think anybody's actually signed yet, but I can certainly speak in my capacity as the Chief Exec of P&O on our position. Our position is that we are committed to signing the Seafarer Charter. We have had some very constructive initial meetings around this with the DfT, and we remain committed to signing the Seafarers Charter.
What's your target date for that?
There is a process where we will be assessed. I expect that to happen within months, but this is something that was initiated a year ago.
Within months?
Is my expectation.
Just finally, Chair, I think just this week, last week, P&O Ferries, your organisation, agreed a sponsorship deal with Hull Kingston Rovers, one of the best rugby league teams in the nation, and that's been cancelled. What's that about?
Yeah, that's something that I think is a shame. So we have a long-standing relationship with rugby league in Hull. We were approached to sponsor Hull KR. Our desire was to support the community and particularly grassroots rugby league. Hull KR have come under some pressure and decided to withdraw from that partnership. I'm very sorry that the grassroots rugby league will not benefit from our contribution, but that's a decision that Hull KR have made, and I respect and will respect.
Okay. I just want to double check something. You said that your crew has 7 days off a month, is that right?
So our contracts on the Channel allow for 7 days off, and on the North Sea 9.
And when did that begin? When did that become available?
I think that's always been the case since we started this crewing model.
Okay. Charlotte Nichols, and I'm going to come to Andy.
Thank you, Chair. With respect, Mr. Hebblethwaite, your evidence today and assertions about the welfare standards within your business are dramatically at odds with the testimony and evidence from your workforce that our committee and parliamentary colleagues have heard. And as Mr. Lavery said just this week, Hull Kingston Rovers Rugby League team rejected your company's attempts at sports washing following an enormous backlash from the community led by employees and former employees of your company. With P&O having effectively become a byword for terrible employment practices driving the race to the bottom, do you not think that restoring the company's reputation relies on an independent investigation into some of these concerns that have been raised at the committee, including the 17-week working?
With respect, I don't agree with the characterisation of our business that you've just made. And I would extend again to you as well as your two colleagues. Please come on board our ships. Talk to the seafarers. That is not what you will find. I am on board our ships. Our fleet director is on board our ships. Our crew, they choose to work for us. They are international seafarers who could work anywhere in the world on any ship. They are professional, highly qualified seafarers, and they choose to come and work for us.
Do you not think that as the chief executive of the company, though, a company that, as I said, has become a byword for terrible employment practices, where we've seen fire and rehire used, that you going onto the ship as the chief executive are going to get a warts and all assessment from your workforce about just how bad things are, people that are going to be frightened about losing their jobs because they've seen how P&O treat people in the past? Do you really think you're going to get an unvarnished account?
I don't think that's quite right. I think that you can take from the retention levels that the crewing agent experience and their ability to recruit the highest standard international seafarer, I think is hard evidence that people who could work anywhere in the world on any ships have chosen to come and work for P&O and choose to come back again.
Rather than taking your word for it to the committee, do you not think that an independent investigation, the company perhaps employing a KC, for example, to look at some of these very troubling allegations that have been raised, would give Parliament the confidence and the sector the confidence that P&O is doing all the things that you say it is in terms of labour practices?
So this is
Might that not be a way forward?
This is a highly regulated, and for all the right reasons, industry. So the MCA in this country, Affairs Maritime in France, we are regularly audited, and it is absolutely checked that we are compliant with, as a minimum standard, or better than, all of the national and international laws that we are governed by. So I think that process already exists. I think that process is followed through on a very, very regular basis and has been in place for some time. So I think that process already exists.
Can I just check before I come to Andy McDonald, why do you think that some members of your crew told ITV that the experience of being on board was like living in jail?
I don't know. I haven't spoken to those people. I can only point again to the fact that people who could work anywhere in the world on any ship choose to come and work to us and make a choice to come back. And my personal experience when I'm aboard talking to our international seafarers is that is not what they tell me. And it's certainly not what their behaviour demonstrates. Their behaviour of choosing to come and work for us and choosing to come back and work for us, I think, demonstrates a different view.
And you'll be aware that both the ITV and The Guardian found people working 12-hour shifts 7 days a week for up to 17 weeks at a time without a day off and without permission to leave the ship. But you've just told the committee that people have 7 days off a month.
So the Maritime Labour Convention requires seafarers to have a minimum of 2.5 days off per month. On Dover-Calais, we contract for 7 days off, and on the North Sea, 9 days off.
The conclusions from this investigation from ITV and The Guardian are wrong. Is that a yes?
I can only tell you what we do.
Let me just check about Phil Crew. So Phil Crew is registered in Malta. It's registered to an address that is shared by 20 companies, established on the 6th of April 2023. Is there any corporate relationship between P&O or DP World and Phil Crew?
Other than the commercial relationship where our crewing agent is responsible for crewing our ships, no.
And what due diligence did you do on this company? Because there's nothing in the public domain other than a PO box in Malta.
So our fleet team, we have a team of professionals who run our fleet team, did all the due diligence, and I have to say that our crewing agent has done an outstanding job recruiting the highest standard seafarers. They've had no problem recruiting them and no problem retaining them. So I'm very pleased with...
Presumably there was a due diligence exercise on Phil Crew that concluded with a recommendation to the board that this was a recruitment organisation that you were going to work with.
Yes, so they went through a procurement process, the name of which I can't remember, but it's a recognised objective process to assess a number of candidates, and the crewing agent that we've ended up with came out as by far the strongest business, and they have proven to be as good as the procurement exercise suggested they would be.
You'd be happy sharing the conclusions of your due diligence into Phil Crew with the committee?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Hebblethwaite. We've met before. You've just told the committee that the decision that you took was legal. You've always complied with international and domestic law. Yet you and I both know when you sat there, you admitted to me that you had deliberately broken the law of this country in failing to consult, as you must under the employment legislation, to pursue your most dreadful fire and replace scam. Do you want to correct the record now so that you are not inadvertently or otherwise misleading this committee and misleading the House of Commons?
So your description of our exchange last time does not fully represent what I said. But let me take the opportunity to be absolutely clear on the position of consultation. So 188 of the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act identifies, recognises that it is not always possible to consult. We sought extensive advice on that issue, and the advice was very clear that it would not be possible to consult, as is recognised in 188 of Tolkra.
And you also told this committee, did you not, that the reason you didn't engage with the trade unions because no self-respecting trade union would in any way tolerate the action you're about to take?
So through 2021, we made multiple attempts to negotiate a competitive and dynamic crewing model. Those negotiations were not successful, and therefore, as a decision of last resort, and one I wish we'd never had to make, we made the decision, the legal decision.
Well, it wasn't a decision of last resort. You could have consulted with the trade unions about your intention to make these mass redundancies, and you didn't. You chose not to. You priced it in. It was the cost of doing business.
So our advice was that had we consulted, then that would have ended up in industrial action that would have brought about the end of the business, because it would have cost us £317 million. £317 million I did not have and could not borrow.
Okay. So you'll be aware that the outcry was enormous. You can't have missed that. We had minister after minister in this place expressing their disdain at your behaviour. You were held out as, not in the highest terms, Mr. Hebblethwaite. You were thought of as very poorly. What sanctions have you personally faced, P&O have faced, or DP World have faced as a result of your egregious behaviour? What sanctions have been visited upon you and your employers?
So I think it is important to reiterate, this is not about me. I am here.
I'm just asking you what sanctions, because we talk of the possibility of taking action against company leaders who break the law. It's part of the 9-point plan. So what action's been taken against you? Anything, something, or nothing?
It is absolutely right that I was asked, we made a very, very difficult decision. It is absolutely right. I was asked before a version of this committee to answer questions when we last met. As a result of that, the government also instigated 2 investigations, the first of which has concluded with no further action, the second of which I remain as confident of. And it does bring me full circle to the point that we took extensive advice on this, and that advice was very clear that our actions were legal, and therefore we took this very difficult decision.
We've been down that road. You openly accepted that you were in breach of employment legislation, so let's not kid ourselves, Mr. Hebblethwaite. You talk about these workers being professional, highly qualified seafarers, paid £4.87 an hour. Do you think that's in any way acceptable? Does that represent good work? You wouldn't do it, would you? You've already told this committee you wouldn't get out of bed for £4.87 an hour. But you expect other people to do it. They're human beings.
The rates of pay that we pay are substantially ahead of the international law that we're governed by.
Okay.
That is international law that this government and all of its predecessors have signed up to, and 96% of all shipping. We operate in an international industry. recruiting from an international field, and most importantly, seafarers, professional seafarers of the highest quality that could work anywhere.
We're talking about the UK.
Here.
You and I are British citizens. We're talking about ships that use UK ports regularly. We have standards in this country, do we not, where we aspire that people who go to work have enough money to pay their bills and have a good, flourishing life. How on earth are these rates of pay in any way consistent with that ambition and those values?
So in British waters, when the law changes, we will pay national minimum wage. We already pay national minimum wage on domestic routes.
So you're waiting for that change before you'll do the right thing. It's a minimum wage for a reason, is it not?
It's a minimum wage for UK workers. We recruit from an international field and operate in international waters.
Look, I get the point you're making, but it just appears to this committee that what you're getting away with what amounts to modern day slavery. At these sorts of rates, at these terms and conditions, people being confined to ship. You talk about it as being a holiday camp, where other people describe it as a prison. So I'll take you on this offer of access to the vessels. I'll tell you what, will you allow Nautilus and P&O to spend some considerable time on these vessels, talking to members of staff without any fetter or control from you or your agencies?
Let me go back to your earlier comment. I categorically resist. In the strongest terms, your description, which I don't think is appropriate.
Well, I've got to tell you, Mr. Hebblethwaite, the people in this country are appalled at the behaviour of P&O over this instance. So I think you can, your pearl clutching doesn't really cut the mustard in this committee. People are appalled by what you've done. So I ask you again, will you allow full access by trade unions, unfettered by you or your agencies, to speak at length to these workers and get a first-hand account?
Our unions represent our employees. They already have access to those businesses and those parts of our business, and those, of course, will do. 786
people lost their jobs. Let's talk about them. Are they members of trade unions, the ones that have replaced them?
I believe so. I don't know. We're not. First of all, they're not our employees. Secondly,
I want to come on to that.
It's not normal for a.
You give an undertaking to allow trade unions to access all of your workforces across all of your ferries, to have those conversations and seek representation so they can better their terms and conditions.
So what I've said is that where there are trade unions that represent our employees, they already have that access. There is no requirement for any additional access.
So let me just turn to the agency that you use. Who is in control of the place that the people that now crew these ships work in? Who's in control of the place of work?
Place of work in terms of
ship.
Cabins.
The ship.
So we're responsible.
So that's yours.
We are responsible for the ship.
So are you responsible for the hours that they work, or is that arranged by other people, or have you got some direct say in that?
Terms under which the crew is employed is set by the crewing agent.
No. What's your input into that? I'm sure if there's a piece of paper that sets out we are the agency, we're going to give you these terms, you've got a say in that, haven't you?
So our requirement is that all crew must be employed on a fully legal basis, and more importantly...
Thank you. So that's it. Despite this charade of the agency, they're your employees, aren't they?
No.
Yep. Well, you just set out the terms and conditions. You read some of the Denning judgments over the years, you'll find out that that's exactly where it is. Sorry, Chair, I just want to ask, you're comparing apples with apples. We talked about professional, highly qualified seafarers on £4.87 an hour. What's your salary?
Let me answer that in 1 second.
Ask what is your salary?
I will answer that in 1 second, but you made an assertion that isn't correct, and I'm afraid I can't allow it to stand.
Do correct the assertion and then come to the substance of Mr. McDonald's
question. The crew are not employed by us. The crew are employed by the crewing agent, a third party that we employ to crew our ships. The crew are not employed by us. That is a very important technical
Mr.
point.
Hebblethwaite, I'm really content about the devices that you use through agencies for employers and companies such as yourself for you to abrogate your responsibilities. I'm familiar with the structure. I ask you again, what's your salary?
The crewing model that we have is the industry standard. My salary is £325,000 a year.
And what were the bonuses you received over the last 2 years?
I received a payment in April 2023
Of?
183,000 before tax.
183,000. So I can't do my maths very quickly, Mr. Lavery. Is that over £500,000?
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
£508,000.
And you're sitting here telling us that you're paying wages of an acceptable rate, something you would never contemplate for yourself or any member of your family or your friends. Do you think that's moral in any way?
I reflected on accepting that payment. But ultimately I did decide to accept it. And I do recognise that is not a decision that everybody would have made. And I do recognise there are people in this room who would not have made the same decision. But it is the decision that I made.
My goodness me, you make some difficult decisions that never impact upon you. They seem to benefit you. The difficult decisions you made to fire people without consultation, a hard decision to take. It's been a tough decision for you to take a salary of over £500,000. You have a tough life, Mr. Hebblethwaite. No more questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hebblethwaite. Let me just check. Your accounts have not been filed, and you are beyond, I think, the legal deadline for filing them. When will those accounts be filed?
I expect the accounts to be filed in the next few days. We have an agreement with Companies House, so they are fully aware, and they have given us the extension that we required. But I expect them to be filed in the next few days.
And why are they late?
They're late for a number of reasons. One is that clearly we had a very difficult year in 2022, and that had some knock-on impacts in the late filing of those accounts, or the accounts that were due to be filed then, and that's had a knock-on effect to these. There have also been some audit requirements that we've had to go through. Mm-hmm. And there's a third thing, which actually isn't just us. It's there's been a sort of industry-wide pension. There have been some industry-wide pension issues that have also had to be accounted for. So a combination of reasons, largely the knock-on from the late filing the previous year as a result of the difficult year that we had in 2022.
Are you able to tell us how much the business owes to Merchant Navy Pensions Fund? How much of the deficit has been cleared?
So we have arrangements in place to fill the deficits that we have. We're going to honour those, and we always have honoured those.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hebblethwaite, for your evidence. What you've told us is that for some of your staff for the first 8 hours, they are paid £2.86. That's half of what you said to Parliament they would be paid when you came before us in March 2022. There has been some improvement when you take into account other aspects of the pay, but at £4.87, which is the lowest rate, that's still only 40% of the national minimum wage, and it is less than the £5.15 you said would be the rate paid to Parliament. You've told us that you couldn't live on this, and indeed your salary is about 104 times what your workers have paid. You haven't got a timeline for signing the Seafarers Charter, but you have told us that trade unions would have unfettered access to your staff. You've given us a great deal to reflect on, and I'm grateful to you for the commitment to provide further information to the committee, but that concludes this panel. Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order. Welcome to the second panel for this morning's Select Committee on Business and Trade, looking at labour market enforcement regulation. I'm very grateful to you from WHSmith and from Staffline Recruitment for joining us today. We asked you to come along because you unfortunately featured in the list of companies that were not paying the minimum wage. Would you like to take this opportunity to apologise to those members of staff that were not paid the minimum wage? Mr. Toal, do you want to start?
Of course. Our situation dated back to 2018, and at the time...
Sorry, the question was just, would you like to take this opportunity to apologise?
We already did when the situation arose.
Want to repeat that to the House of Commons today?
Of course, we're sorry to all the members of colleagues that were affected.
Mr. Ellis?
On behalf of Staffline, we deeply regret it and we apologise for that at that time. I wasn't the CEO at the time of the breach, and I was recruited in October 2020, but on behalf of the group, we take full responsibility and do apologise for that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Todd, could you just tell us why you failed to pay workers the minimum wage? I mean, did you not read the regulations or not understand them or not care about them?
The HMRC conducted an audit in 2018, 6 years ago, and they concluded that we had misinterpreted the guidelines, particularly in relation to colleague uniforms between 2012 and 2018. The specific issue resulted around where we provided T-shirts, shirts, fleeces, name badges for our colleagues, and we asked colleagues to wear black trousers, black skirts and black shoes. The expense of that meant we fell below the national minimum wage for that period.
So it was a case of not understanding the regulations?
We misinterpreted that, and we concluded that with the HMRC. We apologised to our colleagues immediately and then took steps in place to remedy that with all of our colleagues in conjunction with HMRC.
What steps did you take to de-risk your interpretation of the national minimum wage regulation?
Firstly, we changed our internal policies.
Before the error was made, what steps did you take as a business to de-risk your interpretation?
HMRC came into our business before 2012 and identified no issues with our policies at that time. They identified the same policy was inaccurate at 2018, and at that point we changed our internal policy so we ensured that nothing could happen again.
So you had two different judgments from a regulator?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, Mr. Ellis, what went on in your business?
Yeah, our particular problem was that the food production sector required employees to don protective equipment and protective clothing, and this took about the evidence was about 2 to 4 minutes before a shift started, and a similar amount of time after the shift ended. And in those sites, when the HMRC visited the company in 2017, it was identified that there were many sites that were at risk, that those were the sites that didn't pay for the donning of these gowns. If the workers were paid at the minimum wage level, then they would fall below when those extra minutes were counted into the pay. So that there was what it's been referred to as a technical breach, but of course was ultimately below the minimum wage.
And what steps did your business take to de-risk implementation of the rules before you found yourselves on the wrong side of a judgment?
I mean, I'm looking at the evidence now. I wasn't there at the time, but I'm looking at the evidence now, and it was clear that there wasn't as good enough training as could have been provided. The training to our staff, so people who are on site who are responsible for this, it was clear that the training wasn't as good as it could have been. The guidelines and the interpretation. Lots of anomalies, lots of nuances, ambiguity, and therefore, it just wasn't as good as it could have been.
Do you think the regulations are just not clear enough then?
Well, if the definition of an effective law is that it's well known and well understood, and the list that we appeared on had over 500 companies, and this is no excuse at all. But the fact that household names, brands across the country have all, in some way, shape or form, stumbled in this area does indicate that the guidelines weren't as clear as it could have been.
Okay.
But that's not an excuse, Mr. Chairman.
No, I'm just trying to get to the root of what happened. And what sanctions have you faced, Mr. Toal, as a result of the breaches?
We were fined for the breach, just over £641,000.
Okay. And Mr. Ellis?
Yeah, we were fined £3.9 million.
Okay. Thank you. Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Chair. How did you calculate how much each worker was underpaid? If I could start with you, Mr. Ellis.
These calculations were done by HMRC under, in conjunction with us over a period of 18 months, detailed 37,600 workers. And each case, each worker, each element, each site. The HMRC actually visited our sites with our staff and with the customers, and each worker was, each shortfall was identified, each site where the risk was catalogued. And in fact, there were times when our staff were walking through the process again to make sure that the site actually, fell in that list, and then we remediated all of the workers, including any allowances, annual leave allowances, etc., that we were due.
Mr. Toal?
Very similar. We worked in conjunction with HMRC to calculate on an individual colleague basis the remedy that we needed to put in place. We calculated on the average cost of the items, so black trousers, black skirt, black shoes, from a number of different retailers, and agreed those levels with the HMRC. And then based on the length of service over that 6-year period, prorated up to the national minimum wage changes, we refunded and remedied that for every individual colleague that was affected.
Does that explain the discrepancy with how WHSmith has told the committee the underpaid on average £40 per worker, but the Department for Business and Trade say it's £57.80 per worker? Is that where the difference is?
It was a highly complex process. What I did in preparation for today was ensure that the figures I had were accurate. I can confirm the accurate figure on average was £57.80. The highest amount was just over £190 for somebody that worked for that full 6-year period, but I can confirm the £57.80 is the correct figure.
And for both of your companies, for the period of underpayment, you've said in some cases that this was, going back sort of 6 or 7 years, for example. Would you have factored in an interest payment when refunding these workers what they'd been underpaid? Of course, the time that money had been sat with yourselves, it would have accrued value over that time in interest. Is that something that you factored in as part of the payment in either case?
No, I'm not aware of that, no.
No, not aware of that. It was prorated, though, for the changes in the national minimum wage over the time period.
And just to check, one of the things that I'm slightly troubled by is where employees might have changed their bank details since leaving the businesses if they've gone somewhere else during that period. Were there any workers that you were unable to pay? And if so, what steps have you taken to ensure that everyone that was underpaid has received the full amount that they were underpaid? If I could start with you, Mr. Ellis.
That's a good question, and a question that we're rightly focusing on. The HMRC is quite robust in this, and they have their own processes. I mean, the company has gone through, 18 months of constant monitoring and investigation by the HMRC. And what I can see from the evidence, in hindsight in particular, the HMRC is very robust. They know what they're doing. They have clear processes. So they follow up and they account. And of course, you naturally in this area, many of the workers were not born in this country. The workers have come from the European Union mainly. Two events caused their return, which is one was the exit of the country from the European Union. The second was pandemic. And so naturally, if we got returned bank details and bank accounts transfers, it was about 11% of the total. So 89%, which the HMRC said was quite a high figure in this context, was paid. We reserve the pot. That pot is there today, and we continue with multiple efforts to contact workers, and the HMRC is appraised of our progress on a daily basis.
Thank you, Mr. Toal.
We successfully paid 99% of our colleagues after 3 attempts. For existing colleagues where we had their bank account details, that went in. We then chose to use the last known bank account details for any colleague that had left us, and where that was unsuccessful, the last known address. That left a small proportion of colleagues, around about £14,000 worth, that we have held on accounts for colleagues to contact us should anyone, and we really want any colleague that has been affected to contact us. That money is held on reserve.
Thank you. And if the colleague has died, would their family be able to contact you?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Ellis, correct me if I've got any of this wrong, but yours is a recruitment agency for temporary workers, yes?
Staffline is a staffing and recruitment agency, correct.
So, and the sort of sectors we're talking about, logistics, food, manufacturing, and automotive sectors. I've got in my mind food production, for example, and you've been found. I mean, you're top of the list. You're found to have underpaid workers at several food production facilities because you excluded the time it took workers to change in and out of their work clothes. What were you thinking of? To think that was a non-work activity that ought to... I mean, this is critical, isn't it, in the food industry? The levels of hygiene are enormous. That's a critical part of the process to ensure that people are in the right clothing entering into a very highly controlled environment. How on earth could it be? I know you've said, well, HMRC, you've given us different advice, but surely the right thing to do was to say that's a critical part of the job when you're at work.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point, and in hindsight, it does look like that. At the time, and I wasn't there, but I can tell you, if it was widespread amongst many companies, it appears that it was an inadvertent error. It appears that the clarification, the guidance, didn't get the right result. I mean, that's all I could say. In hindsight, it looks perfectly obvious.
Well, just to open that a little bit. But isn't this part of the pathway of exploiting workers and using their time that's actually devoted to the benefit of the company or the agency?
No, that wasn't the intention.
That wasn't the intention. Okay, if I just ask you a little bit on some of the hard facts, because according to media sources, you've put aside 7.9 million to cover historical underpayments. But am I right in picking up that with discussions from the HMRC, you've increased that provision to 15.1 million?
Let me break the numbers down very clearly. So the notice of underpayment from the HMRC was 5.1 million for 37,767 workers. We actually ended up paying 6.65 million to workers because it included annual leave allowances and additional workers not covered by the notice of underpayment. We had a fine of 4 million, which takes you to just over 10.5 million. Then we've got 650,000 that was reserved that we've not been able to locate the workers. There was a couple of million of national insurance and taxes that was also paid. And then we had some costs. And we made a further provision that took us to 15 million of 900,000 in case or in the event of further claims coming out that weren't identified originally.
Okay. Thanks, Chair.
I just want to make the point that the shareholders bore the full cost of that. So it is a point worth mentioning that shareholders did bear, and there was a subsequent equity raise, multiple equity raises, to plug the hole in the balance sheet for that.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Lavery?
Thanks. I think I paid right £57.80 for a uniform. What does that include?
So we, in agreement with the HMRC, at the time of understanding our misinterpretation, we benchmarked the cost of the trousers, skirt and shoes across a number of retailers that we thought our colleagues would use. We agreed those, so retailers like Asda, Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's, H&M and Mataland, and we concluded an average cost of that. And then based on the length of service of the colleague over that period, prorated, that's what established an average cost of £57.80. As I said, the highest cost for somebody that had worked over the 6-year period, on the basis of having to pay for those items on an annual basis, they got just over £192, which was prorated up for the changes in the national minimum wage.
Did the workers provide part of their own uniform before 2012 because the HMRC only agreed that payment should be made between 2012 and 2018. What was the situation before 2012?
As I said, the HMRC had been in a couple of years prior to 2012 and had not established an issue for us. And they said that the issue that we had was between the years of 2012 and 2018. It was at a time that many businesses were being asked to change or adapt their interpretation of this specific requirement around uniforms.
There was people providing their own uniforms before 2012. Did you ever consider any uniform rebates for the employees before 2012? Or is it just because the HMRC investigated a certain period of time that you thought under their ruling you would have to pay these workers?
We complied with what we agreed with the HMRC, which was for the years of 2012 and 2018. And as I said, they came into our business before that and had not established an issue at that point.
Did you not pay anybody before 2012?
No.
Did you consider that?
We complied and we agreed the payments over that period.
I understand that, but the fact that the HMRC suggested that payments should be made during the period 2012 and 2018 established like a clear principle that perhaps you should have been contributing towards the uniforms either partially or wholly. But you didn't consider that before too. And there were people who were actually paying for their own uniforms before the NSW. Is that right? Is that right?
As I said, they came in before 2012 and didn't establish that we had an issue at that point in time, and we complied with the agreement that we had made between 2012 and 2018, and we successfully made sure that we remedied that with over 99% of the colleagues.
And what's the situation now with regard to employees?
We've updated all of our internal policies now, so our policies are very clear. We still provide the T-shirt, the fleece, the shirt, the name badge for our colleagues, and now we allow our colleagues to wear the items that they wish. They can come to work in trainers, in jeans. I was up and down the country visiting stores. I've seen colleagues that have come in jeans, and our colleagues tell us almost unanimously that they come to work in the items of clothing they feel comfortable in.
Mr. Ellis, did he pay workers on the food production lines for changing in and out of work clothes before 2013?
I can't know that. I mean, I wasn't here and I wasn't part of the investigation. But you know, the HMRC and the management team chose the 6 years, or you know, the 6 years, 2013 to 2018. And you know, we remediated all the workers that were identified. We paid the fine, and the shareholders bore the cost for that.
So you're not sure whether there was any payment made before 2013?
I cannot.
And again, it's similar to what Mr. Toal said, that you just simply adhered to an instruction. I know you said it's an agreement, but it's basically instruction from the HMRC to give workers rebates during the period the HMRC stipulated.
Correct.
And what's the number of workers affected by this policy? Have you any idea whatsoever?
Well, 37,767 workers were identified.
And you're happy with the situation as it stands currently?
Well, I'm delighted to say that a new management team, led by myself and my CFO, have led a transformation of the business in the last 4 years. You know, and it's a totally different business to what it was, what I can see from the evidence of 10, 11 years ago. The market has changed, and this has been the most single impactful event, and that is the constraint to supply of labour in this market has been dramatic. And you would have known through the reports during COVID of shortages of workers, widespread shortages of HGV drivers, workers in food production. And so the power has really moved to the worker here. And we find that our workers, for example, our average worker pay is 40% above the national minimum wage today. So in 2013, only 7% of our workers, which is broadly in line with what the Low Pay Commission estimates the size of the market to be, that 7% of our workers are on minimum wage. And that is because the workers, in terms of the supply of workers, there's a constraint. Employers are desperate to find workers, and therefore, you know, it's reflected in the pay.
Thank you. Andy McDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Ellis, you've obviously been looking at this very carefully and perhaps trying to improve the picture. Have you identified non-compliance with other areas of employment legislation? If you have, can you give us a little bit more information about that?
Yes, the specific one that was reported in 2018 was to do with levers, the process of levers, and there was an inconsistency, and it was reported in the accounts, in terms of lever. Now, processing a lever in a temporary business is not as straightforward as it sounds. First of all, you know, many of our temporary workers, could be students, they could be individuals who simply want to work Mother's Day, Valentine's Day, the summer barbecue season or Christmas, Black Friday for the retail sector. And so they come and go. There might be months in between, and they don't want to deregister. Neither do we or our customers want to take them out of the database, so they remain as active workers. And so that's because we have a tremendous cost in re-registering them, right to work, security clearances, and so on and so forth. So that is where the inconsistencies were. There wasn't a process, as I understand it, that was clear. Now, what we've done now is totally changed that. 2018, they changed the process. All workers that asked to leave the company were immediately given a leaving process. So that included, totaling up all outstanding pay, annual leave allowances, etc., and processing that worker as a leaver. Now, we even take the situation where a worker's been inactive for a period of time to keep them on the books, but after 12 months we automatically process them as a leaver. And the process is very clear. They're immediately tagged at the minute they ask to leave the company in the computer system as a leaver, and that triggers all the right payments and makes sure that there are no outstanding liabilities. So that was cleared up in 2018, and the accounts obviously haven't reflected any breaches since then in the 4 years subsequent.
Okay, so you corrected the position when people expressed a wish to leave the company. You've got tighter regime and processes to make sure that was right.
Yeah.
What was the extent of the deficit on that then for those who left the company and were effectively owed money for their work? Have you a handle on that?
We don't have, but what I can say is obviously all liabilities are accrued. And the accounts, we're a public listed company. We employ, one of the largest audit and accounting firms in the world, and these are material amounts, and they're scrutinised and they're audited. Not only that, we're actually licensed by the Labour Abuse Authority, which specifically look at this area, and our license is up for renewal every year. We've just been renewed a couple of weeks ago, and this is the area that they govern.
So on this one, if there are any employees who've left the company who think, well, I didn't get my dues when I left, they can now come back to you
100%,
and say, please tip up.
Yes, 100%.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Both of you have said in your evidence today about other companies which have also fallen foul of these regulations. Mr. Ellis, I think you said there were around 500 companies who had made the same technical breach that you had. Why do you think this is the case?
First of all, I just want to correct that, I actually get irritated at the word technical breach because I think it infers there's some sort of excuse for it, and there isn't. And so I see it's used widely in terms of press releases, and so it's a breach, and a breach is a breach. In terms of it appears from the evidence, and look, I've been in recruitment for 30 years. I was in IT recruitment for 20 of those years. I've been a public company CEO for over 2 decades. And I've only recently, in the last 4 years, come to this sector. It's an exciting sector and different sector, but I've never seen so much audit control, legislation and challenges in terms of the detail. I'll give you a good example. We are subject to 10 audits a year by our customers on these very issues that we're talking about in the committee this morning. So 10 audits. Our training business had 50 audits last year. And of course, we have the main audit from the independent financial auditor. And then we also are subject to the GLAA audits and the license renewal. So we take it very seriously, and it's a very challenging area. And so that was our comment, was that this appeared that good laws, let's be honest, are laws that are well known, well understood, and are enforced and effectively enforced. I mean, it's apparent to me from the last 10 years that this has happened to Staffline. The law wasn't as well understood. People weren't trained as well as they should have been. That's all been changed. We've got a compliance function now that has over 10 people. We've upgraded the expertise so that we've brought in people from the regulator. I think we have one ex-policeman. We've got people from the regulator. We've got a new head of compliance, a specialist in this area. We take extensive advice. As I've just mentioned to you, we took £1 million worth of advice just on these issues that my colleague and I have been talking about this morning. So in that respect, it's quite interesting that it's caused so much challenge for the industry, and we shouldn't really be we should be reserving some time this morning to talk about the future, because in some respects we are fighting the war of the past. The labour market has changed.
This is my question, essentially. You know, insofar as you know, you've outlined the levels of sort of complexity there around auditing, you know, different lines of accountability and things like this. I suppose my question is around what recommendations our committee should be making to government in order to ensure that national minimum wage compliance is a more straightforward endeavour for companies who do want to do the right thing. As you know, you've outlined there, clearly, you know, your company wants to be paying.
I think I can probably speak for WHSmith and Staffline in that. I mean, this is now clear to us. So in that respect, the job's, I think, being done, and the enforcement of HMRC has been tremendous. You know, from what I can tell, the naming and shaming is quite challenging for a public company. We've got all kinds of challenges with that because it was a long time ago. And so that our only recommendation is that the naming and shaming is current, that it's accurate, that it refers to the. I mean, some of our customers had to be put right because they thought that it was new breaches that had happened since the breaches that they were aware of in 2018. So we had to put the record right. So
without naming and shaming, how would former employees, for example, I mean, we've spoken today about people being able to come to you for redress for where these breaches have taken place in the past, without the breaches being something that was public information and it made clear which companies were affected, how would people know that they could come forward?
I 100% agree with that, but it should just be timely. That's all. I think, you know, I mean, there was the department gave a very valid reason about COVID, etc. So I'm sure it was a one-off.
Mr. Toal, is there anything you'd like to add around what we could be recommending in order to make it easier for companies to comply with the national minimum wage legislation as is? Do you think there's simplification that could take place of the regulations, or do you think that now you understand what the regulations are and there don't need to be further amendments made to it?
First and most importantly, we now understand the regulations and therefore we have complied with them in full, and we've had no further breaches since 2018. However, I think in every case where an audit is taken place and the word misinterpretation comes up, then I think at that point that particular rule should be reviewed. For example, back in 2019, the British Retail Consortium, who represents all the large retailers and independent retailers, were asked to consult on the regulations, and at that point they said that this particular ruling on uniform was causing concern for many retailers and needed review. However, I would say this is our issue. We should have caught this earlier, and we apologise to all of the colleagues that were affected, and we put that right. But any time the word misinterpretation comes up, I think that should trigger a point to say, is the rule clear enough?
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That's been very helpful evidence. Thank you. You've both given a very fulsome apology for the breaches that were committed. You've both flagged some challenges understanding the regulations and perhaps posed the question about how further clarification of the law is going to be needed. I think you've both sung the praises of HMRC enforcement, but made the point that it needs to be more real-time than retrospective, and it's both, for both of you, that has beefed up your own compliance functions too. So thank you very much indeed for your evidence, and thank you very much for spending some time with us this morning. That concludes this panel. Order.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently
Order. Welcome to this third panel of today's Select Committee on Business and Trade Inquiry into Labour Market Standards. We're just going to have a declaration of interest from Charlotte Nichols.
Yes, Chair. My father is on the General Council of the Trades Union Congress.
Thank you very much, and I will declare an interest in that I have worked closely with Ben Franklin before through the All-Party Group on Inclusive Growth. Nicola Smith, maybe I could start with you. You've heard some pretty appalling testimony from P&O this morning. Do you think we just heard from the unacceptable face of British capitalism?
I think we've heard that despite repeated government assurances at the time P&O dismissed summarily 786 workers 2 years ago, that this sort of completely unacceptable behaviour would not happen again, that we still have employment practice operating within UK waters in UK shipping, which is actively designed to undercut UK employment law and to deny workers the most basic of employment standards that Parliament has set out should apply to working people across the UK. So it absolutely is unacceptable practice, and it's absolutely undercutting practice that is undercutting other suppliers and operators in the sector who want to do the right thing and to recognise unions, to make sure that they are operating collectively bargained terms and conditions, and that their workforce are treated with dignity and respect. So yes, it is unacceptable behaviour. It needs to be stopped, and I think what we heard today shows us both that we need legislative change and we need new international agreements to make sure that we are not facilitating a race to the bottom in terms of employment practice in UK shipping, but instead we are ensuring that people who work in UK waters are treated with the employment standards that we would all expect to receive in our own jobs.
So the law is basically creating a permissive environment for bad labour standards.
Yes, at the moment we think that's the case. There has been, there was, when P&O originally dismissed its workforce on video message, I should say, you were told basically it was face-to-face, but for many of those workers it was on a video call. On the day they found out that their employment and their family's income was simply to cease without any consultation at all. There were a number of, huge... The way that was done was simply unacceptable, and your committee has investigated into that. There was a failure to consult with unions, workers were dismissed unfairly, there was breaches of directors' duties. We have since then seen no government action at all to prevent fire and rehire, despite commitments that were made at the time that that was possible. And we think legislative change is necessary and achievable in that area. We have seen lots of publicity from the government around about their seafarers' action on minimum wage and various commitments that they have purportedly made to ensure that minimum wages will be paid to seafarers in UK waters. But again, the legislation has not yet even come into effect. It will be limited in its application. It will be limited to, I think it is short routes where there's ports, international services which call at a UK port 120 more times annually. So there will be open opportunities for firms to design their routes so as to circumvent this minimum wage requirement. And it fails to take account of the wider terms and conditions of the workforce. Anyone who is on pay above the minimum wage will, of course, not be protected by that legislation. And the sorts of employment practice that we were hearing about in the previous session, where there appears to be active attempts to present the workforce as not ordinarily resident in the UK so as to imply that UK employment standards do not apply to them, will not be addressed by that legislation. So yes, there is a need for action, legal action. There is a need for a mandatory seafarers charter which takes account of the need for collectively bargained agreements to be respected by both national and international operators in UK waters. And there is a need for direct agreements with other countries bilaterally to ensure that decent employment standards are enforced. We simply don't accept that the international minimum maritime standards that were being described in that session are appropriate for people working on UK ships.
So you then heard evidence from two well-known employers who had both breached minimum wage law, and you will have heard WHSmith say that their breaches were breaches that were also committed by many other businesses, and that they had misinterpreted the regulations. From your experience at the TUC, how much is an innocent misinterpretation of regulations the problem, and how much is it the regulations are wrong, and how much is it the enforcement is just not strong enough? Or is it all three? You may feel it's all three.
I think that there's a number of key issues at play here. I mean, effective enforcement of employment rights is first most effectively done through collective organisation at work. So all the evidence shows that where there's union representation at work, enforcement of employment rights is most likely to be effective. And there are current legislative barriers to preventing union organisation at work. So there is a need to change to make it easier for unions to organise and represent the workforce and to address those mistakes or willful errors or willful attempts to deny workers the pay that they're entitled to when they happen. On individual enforcement routes, there's multiple problems. First of all, the system is chronically under-resourced. TUC evidence has looked at where we sit relative to international labour organisation standards, and we're something like over 1,400 inspectors short of where we would need to be reaching the sorts of levels of resourcing that the ILO say are necessary to effectively enforce across a sector.
1,400 and...
Yeah, I've got the specific number here, but it's at least 1,400 short, and we can send you the specific.
A lot.
We can a lot, and we've got very small, and we've also got. So the resourcing, and I can speak more to that, but the resourcing is a substantial problem. Resources have become tighter over the last 14 years rather than more generous. We've seen cuts of around about 30% in the health and safety executive. We've seen the gangmasters licensing regime expecting substantial further cuts in the period ahead. So the amount of resources put into enforcement has fallen relatively, and there's been a failure to invest in what was already an under-resourced sector. Thirdly, we think there's a problem of fragmentation. So, since 2019, again, as part of the Good Work Plan that didn't deliver, the government have told the enforcement agencies they were going to be merged into a single body. That hasn't happened. There's been no action at all. There's been a lot of time wasted on discussing what could happen and what the options could be, but in effect, nothing has changed. And that sort of fragmentation causes big problems. Because you have different inspectorates who have got different powers, have got different penalties. There is gaps in the enforcement regime. Nobody is, for example, responsible for enforcing unpaid holiday pay. Agencies aren't able to work amongst themselves to share information in the ways that they would if they were joined together. And there can be problems where no one agency takes responsibility, say, for identifying the sort of key trends or drivers or new employment practices that bad faith employers are coming up with that seek to circumvent the legislation and to act on them. So we also think there's a case for bringing the agencies together into a single enforcement body that would make it more effective.
Including those enforcers that are currently in HMRC?
I think work would need to be done on precisely who was involved, but at least, we've got work in employment agency standards, we've got HMRC and the minimum wage team, and we've got people who are responsible for enforcing agency standards and in gangmasters and licensing sector. So at least bringing those agencies together would be a good start from our perspective.
Thank you. Nicola.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to go to each of you for a sort of short opener in how you would define good work. And if I could start with you, Mr. Todd.
Thank you. So at Nest, we're an institutional investor, and we kind of define kind of decent work as a place where people are paid reasonably. We're certainly in the UK interested in the real living wage, the rights to organise and workforces are treated with respect. We think that makes long-term economic sense, and it means for our investors, which are UK workers, we invest on behalf of a third of the UK workforce. It makes sense for them as well, that they want long-term good returns, but they also want to see the economic benefits of decent work as well in their communities and their own jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Cominetti.
I probably wouldn't try to define it because it's a hard thing. You know, there are many domains that you could point to that matter to workers, but they matter differently to different workers. So the obvious things to talk about would obviously be pay, security, being treated fairly, dignity at work, whether you've got as many hours as you need, whether your employer is paying into your pension, whether you're free from discrimination at work, and so on. But you know, these things matter to different extents to different workers. So when I've done work on this in the past, it's tempting to sort of try to draw up a binary, this is a good job, this is a bad job. But I always have basically decided that's not useful. It's more useful to think about what are the ways in which work can be hard or difficult or make life hard, and then look at who that affects and what policy could do to address that. And yes, I think things like minimum wage and security of hours are the things I would want to focus on.
You know, unsurprisingly for the TUC, we think good work is work where people have a voice at work through a recognised union and through worker representation in decision making. Fair and decent pay, so an ambitious minimum wage, but also ambitious pension provision and commitments to publish and to address pay gaps. Guaranteed hours with security over when those hours would be, minimum notice periods, payments when shifts are cancelled, the sorts of decent treatment that any of us would expect if our hours or terms of work were going to be changed, we think should be available to everybody who works in the UK. Treatment and respect with zero tolerance on bullying and harassment, and opportunities for learning and progression, and you know, making sure that workplaces as a minimum are safe and that workplaces are healthy. And we think there's changes that could be introduced in that space, particularly around maximum temperatures. I should also just take the opportunity to say I found my note now on the number of labour market inspectors. We think we need another 1,797 would need to be recruited to take us to where the ILO says we need to be.
Mr. Franklin, what is good work?
Yeah, and from the Centre for Progressive Policy's point of view, I echo what many of the panel have already mentioned. Obviously, pay and security of contract are really, really important. Opportunities for progression and skills development are crucial. Feeling that you have a voice and representation is also really important, as is diversity and inclusion within the workplace as well. And so many of these things are kind of domains that the Taylor Review picked up on back in 2018, and that the government started pushing forward with their good work plan to some extent. And we work with both national government and local and regional places to try and embed good work according to that framework.
Thank you. One of the things I'm always interested by in the evidence we receive from employers and industry bodies on this committee is, when they talk about being good employers, most of the time they talk about their compliance with legal minimums on pay, on standards, on health and safety, and so on. Rarely do we get employers who talk about, how far ahead of all of these minimums they are. And I suppose one of the areas that I've become increasingly concerned about over recent years is the extent to which some of these minimum standards, which were introduced as minimum standards, have become almost a ceiling on standards. So where the national minimum wage, for example, has become the pay ceiling rather than the pay floor, particularly in sectors like adult social care, for example. What do you think that we as Parliament can do when we're trying to encourage good work for it not to be just compliance with what from Parliament is minimum standards, but the kind of spirit of what we're trying to do as well, which is exceeding those? What measures do you think we could be taking that encourage people to go beyond what we set out as the minimum? And would anyone like to start? Mr. Cominetti, I think you indicated.
I was just going to push back a little bit on the idea that setting minimum standards is not the definitely the thing you should be doing. I mean, I don't think there is much evidence of levelling down, as I think you're kind of describing on pay. There are fewer people paid at the wage floor now than there were 10 years ago, and we've got a much higher minimum wage, so about, I think, 4 or 5% of workers are paid at the minimum wage. In 2016 it was 7%. So I don't think there really is evidence that employers are kind of seeing these minimum standards and going, that's as much as I have to do. So I still think there is much more that we should be doing in terms of raising minimum standards, and yes, I would think about that before I worry about this problem of levelling down. For example, minimum standards on sick pay is an area I would very much like the UK to go much further on. It's already the case that many higher paying employers will offer most of their workers an occupational sick pay scheme. So if I go home sick, I will get paid as normal and I can come back to work when I'm ready. But many lower paid workers, paying employers will only offer the statutory minimum. And yeah, I would definitely like that to be a much more ambitious scheme, much more in keeping with what you get in other countries where there's less of an income hit when you have to go home sick.
Mr. Franklin, I think you said.
Yeah, I think I would agree with what a lot of what you just said. So for me, it's a mixture of both kind of hard forms of regulation, so that's national minimum wage and making sure that is properly enforced. And bad work, is feeding into a lot of our economic inactivity story in this country as well. And so we're actually going to see less quantity of work as a result of that, not just poorer quality as people leave the labour market, and particularly at older ages as well leave the labour market because employers have been exacting bad practices. But also importantly is soft forms of regulation too. So, we work with a lot of regional mayors who are embarking on forms of employment charters, where particularly good employers then sign up to that. They are continually verified that they are meeting good standards of behaviour. And I think that's something national government could learn from as well. But, there's a challenge here in terms of really understanding what and how to measure good practice within employers. And we've done some of that work ourselves, but it's really difficult to get to what that workforce structure looks like, particularly for highly complex organisations. So I think from a parliamentary or national government point of view, really trying to understand what might be the standardised metrics against which we can measure good work for large employers in particularly, but potentially medium employers too, is something that we could potentially move on, I think.
Thank you. Ms. Smith?
I think it's absolutely imperative that this idea that good work is incompatible with economic success is challenged, and that there's a role, across public life for people to make the strong case that decent treatment at work is not a nice to have. It's an essential part of an effective, productive economy. And there's an international evidence base now that shows very strongly that societies which act to ensure more people have access to decent rights at work are societies where there is a fairer distribution of rewards and there is greater economic success. We know that there is a strong link between decent treatment at work and the sorts of productivity growth that we've seen. And we've seen over the last 14 years a collapse in our growth rate, a stagnation in living standards, and evidence that where you enable employment models of the sort we heard about this morning, or the sorts we see across parts of our labour market where 0 hours contracts and high levels of insecurity perpetuate, that you don't see either the living standards gains that people need or the growth rate that we need across the economy. So I think we need to take on those employers. We heard from one of them first thing this morning who claimed that there is no way to achieve business success without treating workers, frankly, unacceptably and in ways that, we should all be ashamed of. And I think that challenging that idea on the evidence and on the facts rather than on the assertions is absolutely essential, because we've seen it with the minimum wage. We have seen the minimum wage introduced in this country at a time when, and all of you on this committee will know, employers across the spectrum are keen to tell us how many millions of jobs would be lost. And lo and behold, here we are with the minimum wage at 66% of median incomes and no employment effects whatsoever having been evidenced. And so I think it is time that we can learn from that approach. We can learn from the evidence this morning when we heard that P&O will be able to pay the minimum wage as soon as the government legislates. Suddenly the business model will magically enable that to be affordable in a way that apparently is not the case just now. And we can see that government has got a really important role in legislating to make sure that decent standards are what working people can expect, rather than the insecurity and the mistreatment that doesn't give people the dignity to plan their lives properly, to care for their families and their children the way they want to, despite working extremely hard every day. So, I would like to see an ambitious, positive agenda that makes the case for decent standards at work and also recognises the role of union organisation in ensuring that across the economy.
Thank you. And Mr. Todd, what more can we be doing in order to have this culture change for not just meeting the legal minimums, but aspiring to be a good employer offering good work?
So I think I make 2 points. I think the first thing, kind of the role of investors kind of across the globe, I think we see our role as being able to demonstrate who are the best actors in certain industries and sectors. We're investing in over 2,000 companies across the globe, and I don't think it's our job to tell individual companies exactly how to run their businesses, but being able to demonstrate where we see success in areas of decent work. It is an important role of institutional investors, and I think the more asset owners do of that, and demonstrating best practice and demonstrating how that has a positive impact on long-term returns, the better. I think the second point is about quality of data, and I think the point I'd make is that the data on the sort of social side and on workforce disclosure is not as good as where you see the data on governance and environmental issues. Whereas 10 years ago, when we were investing, trying to get data on kind of climate change and carbon exposure, it was really, really difficult to know as an investor, one, what investment decisions we should be making, but also which companies should we be engaging with to improve standards. And we've seen over the last decade that data has significantly improved to an extent in which you can actually make investment decisions about where you put more of your capital or less of your capital, and it helps us in our engagement and stewardship activities. And part of that has been driven by compulsory disclosure or more standardisation of disclosure, so companies know what they're supposed to be disclosing, investors have more confidence in that information. So I think that journey that companies have gone on in terms of disclosing climate and environmental data, I think we need to go on a similar journey with workforce disclosure.
Just before I go back to the chair, from an institutional investor point of view, what sort of metrics do you think you would want to see in order to be able to judge whether this is a good employer offering good work? What would help you make that decision when deciding where to invest?
So I think it's getting the balance between not wanting companies to spend their entire time disclosing kind of more and more detail. But at the moment, even basic data about pay information, about ethnicity and gender pay gaps just isn't there, or it's not done consistently. So I think starting off kind of modestly and getting consistency across the piece on things like that will be really, really important. And then over time, kind of more data on health and safety, grievance mechanisms and things like that. But I think it's a gradual kind of building that we get consistency and confidence in the data.
And Ms Smith, from the TUC's point of view, in terms of that data disclosure, what information do you think that employers should be judged on in order to make those determinations? Would you introduce something like, obviously we've got the gender pay gap, but would you have something like the gap between the lowest and highest paid employee, for example, pay ratios, those sorts of things? What kind of data does the TUC think would be helpful for people to be able to make decisions in that way?
I mean, we think that there is a case for strengthening company reporting quite substantially, and the biggest, most substantial change we would like to see would be to change the reference in the Companies Act to require companies to report on their whole workforce, not just their employees, because at the moment that means that in many cases the reports that you see don't reflect anybody, the employment experience of anyone who's indirectly employed by that company. You know, our view is that indirect employment was much less prevalent than it is now when the Companies Act was last revised in 2006. And the word employee, in our view, when it was put in as a requirement, wasn't intended to differentiate between different parts of the company's workforce, but it does, in fact, at the moment have that effect. So, you know, given that many companies do employ a significant portion of their workforce indirectly or through a franchising model, the experience of those workers are just entirely excluded from company reports. And I think that would be a really, you know, substantial and important change that would lead to greater transparency and disclosure. I mean, I guess the other thing that we always say in this space is that adopting those changes and improved guidance on workforce reporting, strengthening gender pay gap action plans, all of these measures have impact, but you know, we shouldn't overclaim in terms of any sort of causal link between reporting and improved employment practice. You know, that also rests upon union organisation, upon third-party campaigning, and upon government enforcement agencies. So I think that it's also important to see the role that reporting plays and the external pressure it can facilitate as part of a wider set of ambitions that seek to improve employment opportunities.
I mean, the one point, if I may, I would just add is that this is a country with £2 trillion worth of pension savings today, and it is pretty much impossible for most of us to be able to figure out whether we're investing in companies that aren't screwing their workers, dodging their taxes, or poisoning the planet. So some disclosure could help move investor behaviour. But Mr. Todd, your answer in defining decent work, your list was a little bit shorter than the others. And so I'm just wondering whether our witnesses might be able to help the committee by, as a bit of homework, just providing us with just something in writing that would give us your definition either of good work or of decent work or decent jobs, however you want to express it, just so that we can help identify the overlapping consensus between you to try and help us define how close we are or how far away we are from getting a good work definition. Would that be okay with witnesses? All nodding. Thank you very much. Andy MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. It's been a fascinating discussion. Mr. Franklin, you've actually done a lot of work on this, or your organisation has, with the Good Employer Index. You've already hinted at some of the challenges. Would you like to just say a little bit of that? I'm particularly interested in the issue around job security.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest challenges we found in this work, so the piece of work you're referring to, we looked at the 25 largest employers in the UK. The first challenge was, well, how do you even define that, right? The 25 largest employers, because on Companies House, different structures, what's a subsidiary, what's not a subsidiary, make it quite challenging even to get that far. So that was the first kind of big challenge to overcome. Then in terms of how we looked at the different organisations, well, again, we're relatively limited in terms of the data that we have, right? So we've got annual reports, and different annual reports will say different things, and stuff around workforce and the quality of employment is often quite vague within those annual reports, and that was one of our recommendations actually, is can we get tighter around that. So what we were then left with was looking at standards organisations like the Living Wage Foundation, whether employers were signed up to that, whether they were signed up to be disability confident employers as well. Now that's not a perfect way of doing it, but that was the way we were ranking organisations. But we also looked at violations of national minimum wage and how many of those took place during the time that we were looking at this. And we had to use some crowdsourcing stuff, right? So we were looking at Glassdoor, which is literally where employees go online and rate their company on things like progression and job satisfaction. So we were using a variety of different measures, annual reports, different websites that we were looking at and scraping data from, as well as standards organisations to come to those judgments around the 25 largest. So it is a challenge. It can be done, and we're a team of 10, right? So we're quite a small organisation. But I think it does pave the way to say, actually, if Department for Business, for example, wanted to do something like this on a more regular basis, or subcontract that out to develop metrics that can do this and understand what good work looks like and how to measure that, particularly for the largest employers, it is possible to get something done. It might not be the perfect set of metrics, but it's definitely possible in order to do that.
Well, might that be assisted by the establishment of Ministry of Labour? I mean, other jurisdictions have them in Spain and in the US. The very things that you're talking about, are they best achieved under the auspices of a separate ministry?
I don't know about that. I think, I think for sure it should be something that a department can own. I mean, at the moment, obviously, there's the non-compliance side of things that we heard about earlier today. Something that is akin to that, but looking at specifically good employment rather than bad employment might be an interesting way of raising standards across the board.
These good work indicators that you're in pursuit of, have you got evidence that actually does produce better quality work for workers? Is that what you're...
Yeah, absolutely. So we literally ranked the top 25 largest employers. I mean, one of the interesting findings of that is that the sector, so bear in mind this is a small sample, we're just talking about 25 here, but sector, whether it's in the retail, banking sector, we also looked at public sector employers as well, only explained around a third of the difference between companies. So John Lewis, for example, was right at the top of that at that particular moment in time, whether Tesco's was a bit further down. So obviously they have different business models, but sector is only important to a point in some of these particular domains. And I thought that was a really interesting finding. We also found at that time that those organisations that voluntarily reported their CEO pay and the pay ratio between the CEO and the workforce were higher up overall. It was a good explanatory factor to show where it, in the ranking it was.
You're not forgetting the public sector, you're saying. You very much, because I've got a case going on in my own constituency of healthcare assistants at Band 2 doing clinical work on £11.45p an hour and being robbed of their pay. Ms Smith, can I just ask you a question? It's a bit left field, but so please feel free to come back to me another time. But this issue around in-work poverty and fragile work, to what extent, I mean, I think the TUC have already done some work around single status, and as you said in your earlier evidence, that this isn't simply poorer standards allow profitability and that's good for the economy. Clearly isn't. You've already indicated that the return to the Treasury in people moving from insecure, fragile work would bring in Treasury receipts of around 10 billion per annum as we currently stand. Is it the intention of the TUC to upgrade that work? Because it was a very useful research paper and it might help us on that journey to understand the benefits of single status further. Might be a bit too... I mean, I'm sorry to throw that out.
We're always looking to upgrade work which makes the case for the economic and also the fiscal gains that decent work can bring. And I think it is also important to keep in mind that wider argument and the point that Nye made about when you set a minimum standard, actually the evidence is it can often improve standards and pay above that level in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible. I was very struck by the data on the minimum wage this year, which shows that the share of people on minimum wage is actually falling, despite the rate being the highest it has ever been, suggesting that actually we're seeing pay go up and therefore tax returns go up for those who are in work at a rate beyond what we would have seen otherwise.
Sadly, within government departments, I'm thinking about PCS members in particular, they've got people working in these various departments in this Whitehall environment who are getting a pay rise because they've been increased to the national minimum wage. I mean, do you concur with that evidence?
Well, there's definitely now a growing issue of workers who are on salaried employment who are paid at minimum wage rate, and we are concerned an enforcement issue as well. We've done some work looking at jobs sites advertising roles at salaries that would actually on an hourly pay rate take you to below the minimum wage, and we know that already when we came into this year a very substantial proportion of the Low Pay Commission has put on record its concern that I think several 100,000 jobs look like from their analysis to be underpaid the minimum wage. So the scale of underpayment no doubt remains a problem. And again, going back to where I started on enforcement, that is absolutely why we need to make sure we have a proper review and then act to ensure that where there are rights, they are rights that people can realise in practice. Because, as you all know, a legislative right is meaningless if people can't actually afford it, if they can't access it because of a tribunal backlog, if they can't ensure that their tribunal claim is actually paid out, if there's no enforcement system that will actually take any individual responsibility for their right, or if they can't access a trade union in their workplace because trade unions are denied access to the workplace. So, sort of action to ensure that where the right is provided is enforced is still essential and needs to go alongside any new entitlements people have.
And finally on that, I'll put the same question to you. Do you think that all of the deficits that you've just expertly outlined will be better addressed if we did have a distinct Ministry of Labour in this country?
I think there's a need for proper resourcing of the system. I don't have a strong view on how the government machinery is designed to ensure that's the case. Joined up government, ending fragmentation and ensuring that the current siloed approach ended, absolutely, and I'll leave it to others more expert in the design of government departments than me to think about how best to do that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lavery, I'll come to you, but can I just ask Mr. Todd first, do you recognise some of the problems that Ben Franklin described with information gaps? You're soon going to be investing hundreds of billions of pounds worth of workers' equity investments in their pensions. How do you make sure that those workers are investing in companies that are helping good work, not bad work?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So at the moment we offer transparency in the sense that people can understand what their companies, which companies they are invested in, and there is some data on workforce metrics within that. But at the moment it's a real challenge. So we would absolutely kind of support more detail so we can be transparent to our members. It's their money. Where that money is going, I think, will be increasingly important to them in terms of their trust and confidence of why they would save for their pension.
And I think some of the metrics that you use include diversity at board level. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think that will be really, really important. I think what we've seen, certainly with work on gender at board level, that when targets are set and companies are expected to report on that, the change just in the last decade has been quite remarkable in the UK in terms of increased diversity on the large companies in the UK. And again, I think we would see, we would expect to see similar kind of positive results if there was better data and clearer kind of targets and ambitions.
And that's obviously a different view to the view expressed by the Secretary of State for Business and Trade in a speech that she made recently when she said that boards actually shouldn't worry about diversity at board level and shouldn't bother monitoring it.
This was a government initiative in order to improve diversity on boards in the UK, and I think that's been a successful initiative just over the last 10 years.
But your view then is that diversity at board level does make a positive impact on company performance?
The evidence suggests that's true.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lavery.
Thanks. Just to the Chair's questions with regard to Nest. Nest's overseen by a board of trustees. And I think the trustees have got an obligation, a fiduciary obligation, look for the best interests of the members within the scheme. We've got that probably challenging some of the social governance issues. I'm just wondering what might these challenges be, and how does Nest address those challenges?
So I think a key part of our starting point and when the board thinks about these issues, their primary concern is best interest of members, long-term wealth creation. All the evidence that we're seeing is that by paying decent wages, by having decent jobs, that supports that outcome. So we don't see any kind of contradiction. I think part of the challenge is the time frame in which you're looking at. We're long-term investors. Our youngest members are 16, 17. We're going to be investing for them over the next 30, 40, 50 years. So taking a long-term perspective, I don't think there's any contradiction between good returns and good outcomes. I think the second point to make is if you think about our membership, there are 13 million people saving with Nest. The majority of those people are on medium to low incomes. Us investing in companies or not working closely with companies who aren't paying decent wages. It's decent wages to our members. So there's a virtuous circle here, I think, about our membership being paid a decent wage, their investments getting a decent return so they can get decent outcomes in retirement. So they're both employees, they're consumers of goods, but they're also the owners now of these companies. So them having a voice in how companies operate, we don't see any contradiction between that and fiduciary duty.
Very interesting indeed. What available information have you got on what the trustees might have to make sure that they're investing in good social governance?
So certainly the data on the social side is less strong than the data on governance and environmental factors. So we're part of an initiative started in 2018 by Share Action called the Workforce Disclosure Initiative. That has over 200 of the largest companies in the world has committed to taking part of that. So the data on this is getting better, but there is still a real paucity of good quality data. So it's difficult for us to give assurance to our members exactly where their capital is going in terms of some of the social factors.
Once you've agreed to invest in a company, how does Nest engage with that company to make sure that its practices are, as best as it possibly can be, and how we can possibly improve their practices?
Yeah, through a variety of ways. We're kind of universal owners, so we're owning a slice of the economy sort of across the world. We do stewardship on our own account, so particular companies we will engage with. We took part in a shareholder resolution with Sainsbury's about living wage quite recently. A lot of the work we do is in conjunction with other large asset owners. As you said, Nest is getting quite big, but compared to the trillions of assets sort of across the globe and in the UK, working with other large institutional owners is a key part of our stewardship activity. But then I think the third point to make would be we work with a lot of the largest fund managers in the world. If we can get them to change their stewardship activities, if we can get them to change their voting behaviour at annual general meetings, the actual real world impact is much better than us acting on our own. So that's the main approach we're taking. With better data, I think we can have a much better way of how we deploy capital in order to reward those companies that we think are sort of standard bearers for decent work, and make it clear with those companies where we think improvements can be made that they won't deserve our members' money and their capital. That's a bit further down the line. So we can do that at the moment with kind of climate issues. We're struggling to be able to make those kind of decisions on more of the social and the labour force issues.
Well, that has been an extraordinarily useful panel. Thank you very much indeed. You've basically told us that we haven't quite got a definition yet of good work, but you've kindly agreed to undertake some homework to help us get some consensus on where that definition might lie. You've been really clear that implementing good work is going to take good workforce organisation, the law in the right place, good enforcement and engaged investors. You've all been very clear that the data and the reporting is a bit problematic at the moment, and that's an area where further progress is made. But what's been really important is that you've all said that good work is good for good returns at the company level, and it's good for economic growth at the macro level as well. So thank you very much indeed for your evidence, and that concludes this panel. Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, order. Welcome to the fourth and final panel of this morning's hearings into how we improve the UK labour market. Thank you so much indeed for joining us this morning. Charlotte Nichols is going to open the questioning for us.
Thank you, Chair. The enforcement of workers' rights, as we've heard today from a number of witnesses, sits within quite a complex landscape. Are there any areas of concern or gaps in the current system which make it difficult to protect certain workers? If I could start with you, Ms. Beels.
Yes. But there are indeed gaps, and some of them have been referred to already. So, for example, we have nobody that's responsible for making sure that workers receive holiday pay. We've got the famous or infamous umbrella company problem, and we've heard this morning about different layers of subcontracting that go on in terms of the employment of individuals and the problems that creates. There are things like statutory sick pay enforcement, and also employment tribunals, the fact that it can take a lot of time to get there, and then the question about enforcing the payment. So those are all matters that are gaps. There are gaps in how much we understand what's going on as well, but perhaps I should pause at that point.
And in terms of plugging some of those gaps, is there anything that can be done within the existing framework, or do you think we need to sort of go back to the drawing board somewhat?
I think there are elements where we would need to be legislation, so that goes. As you will know from other evidence I've given to this committee, I see it part of my role as trying to help address some of the gaps, and you will see from the strategies that I've published, I advocate strongly what I call joined-up thinking, so that bodies are not just looking at their own statutory remits, but are also considering who else could be engaged to address the harm that they are seeing. So how can we get better channels of information so that workers know where to go to for advice, so that businesses know where to go to for advice? Those are things that I feel I can do within my remit without any statutory changes, and that's part of what I've been trying to do.
Thank you. Ms. Herrera, are there gaps, and if so, are there things that we can do within the existing framework, or do we need to go right back to the drawing board around this?
I think we've pulled out all these key areas where there are gaps and problems, and I don't know the ins and outs of the mechanics of how you would unpick that, and whether the framework, obviously this idea of bringing it all under one framework is a good starting point. But really the reason that the Good Business Charter was created was because there's a sense that we can't wait for legislation. We've got to start incentivising and raising the bar, because all this stuff takes time, doesn't it, to do it well, and when we do it, then we find companies find new ways to go through those gaps, and so it's kind of a constant catch-up, it feels like, which is where charters can help elevate and inspire from what you were talking about earlier, that floor, so to bring us off the floor and start raising standards.
Thank you. And Ms. Beels, in your answer there, you spoke about umbrella companies, and it's something that our committee has previously raised a number of concerns about. How has non-compliance in the umbrella company market developed since we last spoke to you, and what progress has been made towards tackling these issues?
Well, the government has been consulting about how to look at greater controls over umbrella companies. As you know, there is no definition that captures umbrella companies within the agency, the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, so they can't regulate them. There are one or two umbrella companies that are regulated by the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authorities, so that's where they work in that regulated sector. But the sorts of things that I'm concerned about are sort of disguised remuneration where people are getting paid, but it's sort of claimed that it's not pay and it's a sort of loan or something like that, and that's not right. Also, the skimming of money off before it reaches the worker, so the end user pays the money across to the umbrella company, and the umbrella company takes a cut before it passes to the workers. That's the sort of thing that we see going on. Allegations about non-payment of holiday pay, abuse of national insurance and pension contributions. And then things called mini umbrella companies that are fly-by-night umbrella companies that are here today and gone tomorrow, where there's a benefit because they're small companies, they don't have to pay the same national insurance rate, but then they fold up and the work gets passed to other umbrella companies. I mean, that shouldn't happen.
Because certainly one of the things that I find interesting about how we've moved to this sort of very outsourced model in sectors right across the economy is the fact that from the original employer's point of view, surely that creates a massive reputational risk. With each layer of outsourcing, the more vicarious your responsibilities towards these workers become, surely the more difficult it is, both for Parliament and for organisations like the Good Business Charter, to be encouraging those driving up of standards, because they're losing sight of what's happening under each umbrella.
Yeah, it is a massive challenge. I think one of our first 10 is the real living wage, and the great thing about the payment of the real living wage, as the Living Wage Foundation set it out, is it isn't just for your directly employed on your payroll staff, it is for your regularly contracted. So you are supposed to be looking at everyone, you know, that you could not do your business without, and making sure that they also are paid the real living wage. And we've been looking quite recently at sort of industries like events and security, and you're starting to figure out, well, who are the workers who are manning all these events? And surely our first five are all around, we talked about definition of good work, our first five are real living wage, these fair hours, guaranteed hours, employee well-being, a voice, and equality, diversity and inclusion. There's actually a real broad consensus across these local charters, across the panel before, around these key aspects. And we're saying, well, actually, don't just talk about the employees on your payroll. How many employees are you actually, or how many workers are you dependent on? Are all of those being afforded the voice, the well-being, and all these different aspects? Because otherwise, we're totally losing control, aren't we? We also have ethical sourcing as one of our 10, so that starts to take it wider, and some people will then use that as the way to, well, let's look through both our supply chain, but also these outsourced contractors. Sometimes they'll pop them in there, and at least that we can pick up through their treatment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Margaret Beels, can I just ask you how you felt listening to the P&O evidence this morning?
Their chief executive was eloquent on the subject of the law, and it seemed to me to demonstrate the limitations of the law in terms of delivering a good deal for workers.
Do you think it's acceptable in the modern age that people are paid £4.87 an hour?
I believe that workers in this country need to be paid at least the national minimum wage, and to be paid at that rate, because it lines up with the international agreement, to my mind begs questions about the international agreement.
And when workers are being asked to work, according to the ITV inquiry, 17 weeks without a break, is that acceptable in today's?
I haven't seen that evidence, but I mean, I can see how a worker who lives on board ship could end up feeling that they were constrained.
When we took evidence from McDonald's, we heard that some quite exploitative approaches to 0 hours contracts had led to imbalances of power, which in some cases had led to sexual abuse of workers. Now, when the chief executive of McDonald's came before us, he said that McDonald's corporately should bear some responsibility for that. In writing, he then denied any vicarious liability. We've got a problem with 0 hours contracts in this country, have we?
0 hours contracts are lauded by some as being what the workers want. And I'm thinking about 0 hours contracts. They seem to work well in an environment where there is a lot of work. where the worker can choose whether or not to work because there's plenty of work available. But they work less well where workers are short of work and are looking for more work. And so you'll find 0 hours contracts, for example, in the leisure industry, the hospitality industry, because the person employing them isn't sure about the availability of work. And I think there's a big question to be thought about, and it's an important question about who takes the risk of there not being enough work. Because 0 hours contracts put a lot of that risk onto the worker as opposed to the business who employs them. And I think that's an area that we need to think about whether or not that is correct.
From your experience, have you seen examples of where 0 hours contracts can lead to imbalances of power that can then lead to abuse of employees?
Absolutely. I've been doing a lot of thinking about adult social care recently, and the fact that 30% of adult social care workers are on 0 hours contracts. And I was quite shocked by that as a statistic. I mean, and if you look at the domiciliary workers, it's 38%. That's the care workers that go from one property to another to provide care. And that is a figure that I feel is uncomfortable, given the requirement for work in that area.
We've also heard evidence on this committee, for example, when we took evidence from ASDA and their owners, TDR Capital, that accounts were so opaque that information was not available to, for example, trade unions who were bargaining on behalf of workers. Is there a need for greater information rights for workers in our country?
In terms of, I agree that accounts can be very, very opaque, and I think one of the things that you've been talking about are about good work indicators. And one of the things that slightly troubles me about good work indicators is the extent to which there can be creative accounting around good work indicators, and it's made to look better than it is. But I am in favour of transparency. I think that if you've got nothing to hide, why would you not be transparent?
Interesting. And this problem was compounded in the case of Wilko, for example, by some failures in the audit regime, which failed to reveal the risk that business was running. And of course, when it went bankrupt, hundreds, thousands of workers lost their jobs, and the taxpayer then had to pick up the bill for pension liabilities. So this obligation on getting information and reporting right probably spans some quite big parts of the economy.
Yeah. That's right.
Do you think that enforcement of workers' rights in our country is strong enough today?
I've been listening to the discussion about numbers of inspectors and reflecting, and the question about do we have enough inspectors? Are they doing the right things? Are they going to the right places? Are things that exercise me regularly? Because we are, as has been said, way below the ILO standard. I was recently reading a report that was looking at the enforcement of the national minimum wage across Europe and how it's done in different countries and the patterns. We are by no means alone in having numbers of inspectors that are well below. And that, to my mind, is about prioritisation and budgets. In my strategies, I have, maybe you would argue it was the Council of Despair saying, if in a tight regime in terms of public finances, I'm going to take as an assumption that the bodies are not going to get more money to pay for more inspectors. And therefore, my focus has been how do we get the most out of what is there. But in terms of what I am seeing is that I am seeing all three bodies feeling quite constrained by their budgets. I worry that might mean that they are less prepared to work beyond their narrow remits because they'll have targets that we'll set to them as to what they have to deliver. And if they are doing things that are not delivering their own targets, then that is potentially a problem for them. And I see this joined-up approach as being really important. So, you know,
So would you like to see stronger enforcement of labour rights than perhaps we have today?
Yes.
You have previously expressed to the committee that you were frustrated about the delay in the publication of the labour market enforcement strategy. Where is this strategy now?
Well, thank you for the committee's support for the last time. We did eventually get that first interim report published. Last year we did a bit better. I submitted the draft strategy at the end of March and it got published by the middle of October, which isn't great, but it's better. My target this year is to get it published before the summer recess. Partly in the expectation that people might have other things on their minds after the summer recess. So I'm quite keen to get it published before the summer recess. But more particularly because these things have a currency and an immediacy. You know, if there are issues that we think needed to be addressed, then I want them to be addressed now, not in 6 months or 9 months, 6 months or 9 months' time.
I think you've told us in the past that Kevin Hollinrake, the Minister, had asked you for advice on how to improve the labour market enforcement strategy. What was the result of that conversation?
I've had very positive support from Minister Hollinrake. I wrote to him and he responded within 2 or 3 weeks of me writing, and he very much supports the work that I'm doing in trying to draw the enforcement bodies together. He very much supports the idea...
Does he support it so much that he's going to actually move ahead and introduce the single enforcement body?
I have to, of course, reflect on what they actually say about that, which is that they are pausing their plans to create a single enforcement body is what they say.
We've learned from conversations about trade talks that generally means they've broken down.
Well, they reflect on the fact that there will be a significant organisational change and that creating the body would disrupt the work of the existing operational bodies. And so what Minister Hollinrake is looking to me to see what could be done within the existing regime. Now, I've flagged to Ms Nichols some of the gaps that would not be, that I can't.
We've got a picture of the existing regime here, and it's incredibly complicated.
It is.
And you've flagged to us today that there's a real anxiety that people are sticking within their boundaries rather than working together to improve things overall.
You won't be able to see this, but the work that we did on adult social care has been a further development of that sort of mapping.
That looks even more complicated.
It looks even more complicated because of the number of government departments that are involved in the provision. So I think every interface creates a problem in terms of exchange of data, exchange of common purpose, and so I would far rather see things drawn together.
Thank you. Andy MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. That's a bit dispiriting to think that, because it was 5 years ago that the government announced that they would create a single enforcement body, and that seems to be somewhat of a pipe dream at the moment. But if it was to happen, what should the scope of a single enforcement body be?
I think that's a really important question. And one that's been I've been giving thought to and want to carry on giving thought to because in a way the plan to create the single enforcement body was created 5 years ago, and is that still the right answer today? Have things changed? Are things different? And one of these questions that I think about is who should be enforcing workers' rights, as between there being statutory enforcement bodies versus the worker themselves having to go to an employment tribunal in order to enforce their rights. And I think in deciding what the single enforcement body should be doing, we should also be looking at that question about what is the most effective way of enforcing workers' rights. And I'm not sure it is just simply by putting together the three bodies.
So you're basically saying that we're not in a happy position in terms of the ability of workers themselves, either through their trade unions, to enforce their rights. And of course, we've got significant backlogs in employment tribunals, so that anybody who does get redress is going to be a long time waiting for it, and will be put off. Is that right?
And at its simplest, an employment tribunal resolves the case of the individuals bringing the case. And then there's the question about, well, what then happens to other workers employed by the same firm, or what happens to other workers in the same sector, and the importances for businesses in terms of actual clarity about what they have to do.
Have you any handle on the extent to which tribunal awards, once they've eventually achieved, are actually ever paid?
I don't track that myself, but I know that it is a problem that has been flagged and was flagged to this committee, I think.
Do Violation Tracker provide any useful input? There's a portal that provides this information from tribunals and other...
The department itself is responsible for that.
Well, should it be?
That's
in the United States, they have that's actually out with government and out with the control of government.
I mean, the enforcement of employment tribunal findings was something that was thought of as being potentially within the scope of a single enforcement body.
Yeah. So we've seen all our tangled diagrams of all this cross-departmental responsibility, and where there's a worry that if, for example, there was a single enforcement body, it would just be the badly resourced individual enforcement bodies amalgamated to produce a super under-resourced single enforcement body. Is that a worry? That's the first part, and how we might smooth that transition. And the second part, given we're competing with tangled webs here, we have ours, you have yours. Would it not be infinitely better if we had a Ministry of Labour as obtained in other jurisdictions around the world? Have you considered that, or is it outside your remit?
I remember we had this conversation the last time, and I said then, and I repeat, that I thought there needs to be a greater priority and urgency about workers' rights, and that ministers should be showing a lead in that. But if we think about the adult social care issues that I've been looking at, and one of the issues about that is, which is the department with lead responsibility for adult social care, and it's Department of Health and Social Care. So you end up, they set the policies which then determine the local authority. So they set the policies. The local authorities, which is another department, is responsible for the local authorities, and through the procurement processes of the local authorities, in some measure, drive the behaviour of their contracting, and then that feeds through to how workers are paid. So I don't think a Ministry of Labour would address all the issues that need to be addressed if you're wanting to secure workers' rights.
We have heard, and I'll finish with this, Chair, we have heard other evidence that good work and good pay not only leads to people having good, secure lives and flourishing lives, but it's actually good for the economy more broadly. Is that your view as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
You can keep the floor, Mr. MacDonald, actually. And,
if I could,
if you would.
That would be helpful. Actually, it's to Jenny more broadly. I'm very interested in this issue of voluntary charters. We've had a few mentioned today, and with you, it's a good business charter. So I'm just trying to understand how those charters improve the quality of jobs for workers. What are the benefits of them?
The benefits of them are that they are bringing us up from, rather than on the floor and then we enforce when people fall below. It's really about inspiring employers to do better, to go beyond the legal minimum. And so we worked with the TUC and the CBI to bring together something that is stretching enough for businesses to make sure that they are working towards it, but is making sure that the workers are heard. And as I mentioned, there's real broad consensus around that. Now, what we see really as the benefit is you start with probably your more responsible employers, let's face it. The ones that are like, yeah, we pay the real living wage. We haven't actually got anyone on 0 hours contracts because we don't think they are right. We care for our employees in lots of different ways, good give sick pay and really diverse workforce and got a voice. So you've got that kind of, you've got those employers saying, this is what we believe in, and actually all the evidence that's stacking up about having better productivity, more innovation because you've got a diverse workforce, and customers are demanding it, employees are demanding it. So the real value and benefit then comes that, you know, we talked about a level playing field, that others are encouraged to bring themselves up to this level. So you don't have the responsible employers here, though arguably they will do better because this is what customers, employees, they are recruiting the best talent because employees are looking for organisations that care about all this stuff. But that's the idea that you bring it in to something, and that's what's happening in Greater Manchester, Liverpool City Region, in London as well, that you get a few employers that accredit or certify, and then it drives good behaviour up. So that we're not just sweeping off the floor, but we're actually inspiring.
You've got 10 component parts to it.
Yes.
How did you settle on those? So what was the?
So the Good Business Charter is founded by Julian Richer, a retail entrepreneur. So it started with what he does in his business and how he, for decades, has built up business on treating people right, and then they'll treat customer. You know, if your employees are happy, they're going to give a better customer service, and you know, they've won a lot of awards for that. So it started there with the real living wage. He's passionate about 0 hours contracts, so we've got that in there. Employee wellbeing, of course, and employee representation, working with the TUC, and then, of course, the equality, diversity and inclusion. And we really wanted to have a holistic, responsible business. This isn't just about being a responsible employer towards your workers. It's broader than that. So then, of course, we've got the environment in there, paying your fair share of taxes, because quite frankly, it's not okay to be operating in the UK and not doing that, and customers care about that. And then you've got your ethical sourcing and your prompt payment to suppliers, which actually a lot of people think that's operational, but it's, you know, loads of small businesses are going out of business because they're not paid on time.
Yeah, but you see, we've heard from P&O that they think they're running these wonderful health clubs for their employees, and they're great. So you could get in a situation where because it's self-accreditation, isn't it, with this, and we've here on ESG and all the rest of it, people boast about these badges, but you know, it's difficult, isn't it, to make sure that that's actually enforced. Is that a territory where we should be looking at enforcement? If these are the things that we really want to happen, is that the sort of thing that, you know, we should be doing that as an enforcement measure rather than above the Charter?
I think, yeah, two things I'd say. One is that it has to be all 10, and I think that's been a really interesting journey for the last 4 years, that some organisations are great at 8 or 9 of these, but, oh yeah, you know, we've got a tax haven, so we're not paying our taxes. Or in the case of P&O Ferries, well, yes, they might think they're doing great well-being, but they're not paying a real living wage to their staff. And
are you able to say a little bit more about the sectors that might be more amenable to this than those that are not?
Yes, there are, because the real living wage is a challenge, and I think obviously we're in a challenging environment. The sectors that find this harder would be your hospitality, your care sector, but even retail. Talking to sort of supermarkets, for example, they've had pressure to raise their wages to real living wage, but what about the outsourced delivery drivers, security, and that's where. So there are these sort of sectors that will struggle with it.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. I suppose the final question to you both really is that, you know, there's an election imminent. Who knows what the outcome might be? What are your recommendations and advice to the next government about what they should be doing to improve labour rights in our country based on the experience that you've got? Jenny, do you want to start?
So for us, it would be about having, as part of the manifesto, a real focus on being responsible employers and really feeding that through everything. So procurement should be for organisations that can clearly show they are responsible employers. We've talked about Nest, looking at how investing is for organisations that are able to meet our 10 criteria. We used to think this was basic common sense, but it turns out it's a high bar. Sadly, it is a high bar. And by placing that in as something that we really are passionate about, responsible employers, and one of the things about the way something like the Good Business Charter works is that Organisations have to own it, they have to promote it internally and externally. So that is a great way of employees being really aware of what their rights are and the fact that their employer is doing all this, and when they look for another job, is this other employer doing it as well? So, you know, really bringing it in as part of the heart of who we do business with in this country.
Doesn't sound like P&O is going to qualify anytime soon. Ms. Beels, what's your advice?
Can I, before I say that, just to clarify, the figures that I gave you on 0 hours contracts relate to England?
Yes, of course. Thank you for that.
So that I don't have the numbers for the devolved administrations, although that's one of the things that I will be following up with because it's such an important sector. In terms of what I would hope for in when I'm reading the manifestos, because that's an important thing for me in deciding where I will put my vote. I'm concerned about the end delivery of the rights of workers. That we've got national minimum wage and it has certain coverage, but as Jenny has talked about, there are other workers in the supply chain, you know, and what is being done about making sure that this is a good work country. And I shall be looking for the commitments that deliver a good work country for us.
Well, that is a very nice note on which to end. Thank you so much for your evidence today, and thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It's much appreciated. That concludes this panel, and that concludes this session. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.